Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is what everyone else is thinking about, and that's ISIS, and the way the West is analyzing ISIS. I've been paying very close attention to the speeches President Obama has made and the statements he has given. I actually collected all of his comments about terror since January and read them as a single document in order to see if there was a consistent thesis that developed. This is for my own analytical purposes, and I turned them into one huge, large essay. It was very insightful. Now I understand how President Obama has come to his conclusions about violent extremism. President Obama, like many other Americans, thinks that Islam is a religion like Christianity. Islam is a religion like Judaism. Islam is not a religion like Christianity. Christianity is faith-based. It's a religion based on faith. Belief is everything. And belief is the emphasis in what is called Pauline Christianity. You see, Paul ridiculed the Jews for adhering to the precepts and laws of Judaism. He took what they called the wine of Judaism. That means he took only the nice parts and removed the rigid behavioral requirements known as halakha, the daily precepts that govern life. So Paul retained the concept of belief and faith. But Islam is like Judaism. It has essential beliefs, but their world actually revolves around a set of laws. Their world revolves around codes of behavior, and those codes dictate actions. In Arabic, there's no word for religion. The most commonly used word is din. Din means to comply with Sharia law in Arabic. It also is used to describe Christians in prayer. The word comes from the Zoroastrian Persian. It's not Arabic. Interestingly, in Hebrew, too, the word din means law, and for the same reason. Like in Arabic, there is no Hebrew word for religion. Hebrew borrows a different word from Persian to describe religion, and that word is dat. Not to have a word for religion in a religion should be telling you something. It means that those describing it by using the word religion do not understand the complexity and the inner workings of the system itself. Islam cannot be compared to Christianity at all. There's no such thing as a concept of secular Islam. There's no secular anything in Islam. Actually, one cannot even say hello or goodbye in proper Arabic or respond to any greeting without invoking the name of Allah. The West needs to understand this. The West and the leaders are so far removed from their understanding that they say the darndest things about ISIS. Like, just give them a job and that'll solve everything. That if you just give ISIS members a job, everything will be okay. That would solve the problem of Islamic terror. At first, I believe the State Department Deputy Spokesperson Marie Harf's interview with Chris Matthews on MSNBC to be too inane to be taken seriously. Now, on further reflection, after she said these things, and given the fact that there's been no backpedaling by the administration, I realize how serious she really was. In response to questions about ISIS and whether the administration has a plan for dealing with ISIS, Harf responded, and this is her quote, "We cannot win this war by killing them. We cannot kill our way out of this war," Harf said. She continued, "We need, in the longer term, medium and longer term, to go after the root causes that lead people to join these groups, whether it's lack of opportunity for jobs," and then she continues, "We can work with other countries around the world to help improve their governance. Harf said. She continues, we can help them build their economies so that they can have job opportunities for these people. Many members of the press skewered Harf. Her responses were anything so far away from realistic. They were ridiculous. They gave a sense that Washington had no idea of what ISIS really is or how to deal with them. And yet, I still expected that someone in the inner circle of Washington would have the presence of mind to stand up and say something. Simply getting a better economy will not change ISIS's point of view. The bottom line, I was not shocked by the comments made by Marie Harf, nor by what the press did when they ridiculed her. I was shocked that the administration has not clarified the points Harf made in the name of the State Department and the U.S. government. That means they agree. And that is truly frightening, because no amount of leadership training or economic development will transform ISIS. No amount, not ever. Everyone should know that ISIS is not hurting, not for recruits and not for money. Reuters recently ran an insightful piece about how Europe is beginning to crack down and stem the flow of Europeans coming into ISIS to fight in Syria and Iraq. So new laws are preventing citizens suspected of interacting with ISIS from returning home, and seizing the travel documents of anyone suspected of being a member of ISIS or ISIS activity are now in effect in a lot of European countries. It's an attempt to strangle the constant stream of European recruits into ISIS. So ISIS has responded. This is what they're saying, that most of their recruits are no longer coming from Europe. Here's one comment from ISIS. Now, most of the foreign fighters are coming from Asian countries like Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. They are tough fighters, said an official who was quoted by Reuters. Another ISIS official said that at first people did not take ISIS and their recruits seriously. That was a big mistake, he said. And here's his quote. At first, these countries took us lightly. They thought the fighters will come here and die. But what they did not see coming was that they get trained and also started to contact their friends and relatives to join. It is true that recruits are flocking to ISIS from all over the world, and especially from the Far East. There has also been an influx of recruits from Libya and Egypt. Again, understand, ISIS is not suffering for lack of funds or manpower. Coming up next, points of view. Here's what some important voices have been talking about. The first column is from the online edition of the New York Times. It was published on Monday, February 23rd, 2015. An important point. Sometimes my dates that I'm giving on air are not the same as the dates that you see on the screen or that you might see if you look up the piece. And there are several reasons for this. First is the online editions versus the print editions. They often have different dates for the very same column. The second is that when the column is in syndication, or even the cartoon is in syndication, it gets dated differently in different publications when it's posted and printed. Anyhow, the first column is from the New York Times and is authored by Francois Furstenberg. Furstenberg is a professor of history at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. He is an expert on the history of France-U.S. interaction and diplomacy, and the author of When the United States Spoke French, 5 Refugees Who Shaped a Nation. The piece is entitled in the New York Times, Mr. Netanyahu, Take Note. And then there's a subtitle. This is not the first time a visiting dignitary has gotten tangled up in a partisan conflict. Furstenberg draws on history and shows that Netanyahu is repeating a very ugly mistake by trying to pit one branch of government against another. Furstenberg begins, quote, ever since he announced plans to address a joint session of the United States Congress next month, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel has become a central figure in American domestic politics. And while he claims surprise over the controversy, he has kicked up, those with a sense of history will know that this is not the first time a visiting dignitary has tangled up in a partisan scuffle. Now, I can honestly say that there is no way that Netanyahu, or for that matter, almost anyone other than the author and some scholars of history, knows the story that he is about to describe in his column. The story is about the arrogance of Edmond Charles Guenet. Now, he's a French ambassador to the United States, and it takes place in 1793. Yes, early 1793. Guenet overplayed his hand and attempted to force President George Washington's decisions because of the great love Congress had for France. It was specifically about forcing the U.S. to side with France against England. Furstenberg writes, like Netanyahu, Guenet saw his country as a key American ally. He believed that the two nations shared similar ideals and that both confronted enemies of pure evil. Furstenberg continues with the following quote. When Guenet landed in Charleston, South Carolina, he was bombarded with festivals and celebrations. The outpouring of pro-French sentiment overwhelmed him as he traveled overland to Philadelphia, the nation's capital. One should note that Philadelphia was actually the capital of the United States at that time. So let's explain what really happened and Guenet's point of view. George Washington was not interested and had completely different ideas. After all, George Washington was the president and in charge of foreign affairs. A few weeks later, after this whole interaction, Washington issued his famous Proclamation of Neutrality, which was to define and shape U.S. foreign policy for the next 120 years to come. The issue became so acrimonious that Thomas Jefferson, who was one of the greatest, staunchest pro-French personalities in U.S. politics, and, by the way, the Secretary of State, said it very clearly. And here Furstenberg quotes Jefferson saying that the president, quote, is the only channel of communications between the country and foreign nations. It is from him alone that foreign nations or their agents are to learn what is or has been the will of the nation. Furstenberg continues, and with another quote by Jefferson, quote, no foreign agent can be allowed to question the president's authority nor to interpose between him and any other branch of government. The end is obvious. The U.S. began creating a great relationship with England, and French ties dissolved. Furstenberg concludes, it says, Mr. Netanyahu, Mr. Boehner, take note, unquote. That's the end of his essay. Now, this was truly fascinating and a remarkable essay in itself. There is no doubt that the parallels are uncanny between the Guenet story and the Netanyahu story. But the difference is that the threat from Iran is actually at the door of Israel and not at the door of the United States. And that makes a big difference, which means that Netanyahu believes that he must defend Israel in any and every way, even at the expense of relations with the White House. And that leads, or segues, perfectly into the next piece, which is an editorial from the New York Post, published on Sunday, February 22nd, 2015. It's entitled, Iran's Israel Intentions, unquote. Now, I've got to tell you something. I read the New York Post. My profession requires me to read all kinds of publications in order to be in the loop, in the know, to understand what's going on and what's happening. When some people hear that I read the New York Post, they look at me with one of those looks. You actually read the New York Post, is the look. So I must defend the New York Post. I like the New York Post. The chief reason is this. They are unabashedly pro-Israel. And I actually like to read a paper that's unabashedly pro-Israel. That's also why I like to read the Wall Street Journal. But you should also note that I read the New York Times too, and the Washington Post, and the LA Times, and the Chicago Tribune, and the Boston Globe. You get the picture. And that's just the newspapers in English from America. The entire episode reminds me of a famous joke about a Jew in Nazi Germany who's sitting in the park and reading the infamous or notorious newspaper called Der Stürmer. We mentioned that in an earlier show. It was a hateful anti-Semitic paper of the Nazis. It was very important and an essential propaganda tool for them. Another Jew sees his friend reading Der Stürmer in the park and asks, "Why are you reading that terrible Nazi newspaper?" The first Jew says, "When I read the Jewish paper, I see bad things, how terrible things are, how weak the Jews are. When I read Der Stürmer, they're constantly saying how powerful the Jews are and how successful the Jews are." The second op-ed is an editorial, not a column. It's the point of view of the editorial board. It's not authored by any name. So just to remind you, this is from the New York Post. This editorial actually begins, quote, "Israel is the one nation whose existence is most threatened by Iran," unquote. The editorial continues, quote, "Understand this fact, and you understand why Israelis are so alarmed by the deal President Obama is trying to strike with Tehran," unquote. This piece is very short, as many editorials are. It's about 300 words. It's pithy, and it concludes in the following way. That's what Benjamin Netanyahu wants the American people to understand, and that's why. Partisan sniping notwithstanding, he's bent on making his case to Congress, unquote. The Post is correct. That is exactly why the Israeli Prime Minister's point of view, and that he cannot afford to let Iran get the bomb, and then see afterwards if Iran will cooperate with the world's supervisory agencies. Once Iran has the bomb, it will be too late for Israel and for many others. This last column is by Rabbi Joshua M. Davidson. He's the rabbi of Congregation Emmanuel in New York City. It's known as Temple Emmanuel. It's a beautiful, almost Jewish cathedral temple. It's remarkable in its grandeur, in its power. It is probably the most important and influential Reform temple in the United States. So Rabbi Davidson's voice carries a lot of weight. This piece appeared on Saturday, February 21st, 2015, and it was published in the New York Post, among many other outlets, by the way. The column is called, quote, "Terror's War on Faith, a Cardinal Wake-Up Call." Rabbi Davidson begins by saying that, quote, "Shortly after the horrific ISIS immolation of the Jordanian pilot, a congregant called, urging me to denounce the atrocity as antithetical to every core principle Judaism stands for," unquote. So Rabbi Davidson at first did not understand why this was not obvious to everyone and what particular role his voice could play. But then he read Timothy Cardinal Dolan's condemnation in the Post, which said that these acts are an attack on all religion. That stands for good. You see, religion stands for good in his eyes, and that was Dolan's point of view, that all fanatics are bad, and they are attacking all forms of religion. So Rabbi Davidson concludes, my congregant was right. What I thought was obvious isn't obvious at all. For religion's sake, we must condemn the atrocities committed in its name, unquote. Davidson is correct. Evil must be condemned, and leaders, especially religious leaders, must explain why. They need to stand up and condemn. Our world is so filled with gray. Everything's gray. So seldom do we get the opportunity to identify real evil and teach about it and preach about it. This is a very important moment for religious communities and their leaders. Carpe diem. They must grasp the moment immediately. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. Both these cartoons are by cartoonist Rick McKee. He is a political cartoonist for the Augusta Chronicle. He's been there since 1988, so he's been there a long time. This first cartoon is a play on the TV game show, The Wheel of Fortune. The host, Pak Sajak, is covering his eyes in despair as is the Vanna White type woman who flips the tiles. The contestant is Obama, who is answering a question. The hint is a thing. 3 spaces are open, and the letter I is missing in all 3 spots. You and I, looking at the cartoon, know the answer is Islamic terrorism. The only one who cannot see it is Obama. The caption reads, "Gee, Pat, I don't have a clue. Workplace violence, armed insurgency. Can I buy a vow?" It seems that what is obvious to everyone is not even apparent to the president. It is a very funny and very sad cartoon. The next cartoon is also by Rick McKee and was published February 10th. There is a cage burning with yellow fire shooting out of the cage. President Obama is outside the cage, and he's preaching to the cage. And he's saying the following, quote, "Yeah, well, Christians have done terrible things too, you know?" Unquote. And terrible is actually written in blood red letters. Here McKee is brutally honest about how he sees the president's comparison of Christians to ISIS, that the Crusades were brutal and murderous too. These 2 cartoons by McKee are not extraordinary. I mean that so many cartoonists have taken aim at Obama and his reluctance to call terror Islamic. Now, I cannot say that every single cartoonist has done it, but almost every cartoonist that I have engaged with, read, and played around with on the screen has taken serious shots at the president on this issue. In a moment, my own perspective and a few predictions. There have been reports that ISIS has moved significant numbers of fighters into Turkey as sleeper cells. The fighters are in Turkey as these sleepers that will strike when ready. At the same time, Turkey has been guarding a tomb of its founder's grandfather, Süleyman Shah, which is located in Syria about 25 miles from the Turkish border. And the tomb is in Kobani, in the region of Aleppo, in the province of Aleppo, and has been the site of huge battles between ISIS and the Kurds, as well as the target of airstrikes by the United States and their coalition partners. 45 Turkish soldiers protect the tomb. Recently, Turkey launched an operation to transfer the tomb back into Turkey. 1 soldier was killed in the action. The Turks say that the death was not a result of fighting or defending the tomb, but an accident that took place during the night when they moved the tomb itself. Despite Turkey's reluctance, we're going to see many more operations by Turkey and Jordan into Syria and Iraq. You see, Turkey and Jordan will be the boots on the ground for the coalition. On another issue, Kaspersky, the Russian cybersecurity firm, announced that they have a new set of malware that they found spreading in the Middle East. It's a series of worms. The new malicious software is infecting computers throughout the Middle East itself, especially in Iran. Kaspersky says that this set of malware and worms is very similar to Stuxnet. You remember that name? Several years ago, Stuxnet was one of the worst vicious worms to invade Iran, period. It took over their nuclear program and infected almost all the computers connected to and development of their nuclear technology. A spokeswoman for Iran's nuclear program about this latest danger said the following, quote, "The Islamic Republic of Iran pays great attention to this matter because we are one of the targets of cyber espionage." The word on the street is that Israel and the United States have been guilty of creating several waves of these computer viruses. Stuxnet is, according to these rumors, just one example. So we are now entering another stage of Stuxnet. It remains to be seen who becomes infected and who spread the virus itself. Now you know what I've been thinking. Let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Do you know what ISIS and ISIL stand for? We use them all the time. The administration only calls it ISIL. That's interesting. Let me explain what they stand for. ISIS stands for the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. ISIL stands for the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. The word Syria in Arabic is al-Sham. It's much bigger than simply the country that we know today as Syria. It's a huge swath of land, a region. That is why the Levant is the translation preferred by the administration. Levant is a French word. Ironically, it's also used to actually deal with the colonial period and refers to the region of the Middle East that hugs the Mediterranean Sea. Today, ISIS calls itself just IS, which means the Islamic State. They do not want to be called Daesh, the Arabic equivalent of ISIS, or ISIL anymore. Actually, ISIS has cut out the tongues of those who have used the term. Just last week, I watched a young boy receive 60 lashes for using the term Daesh, the Arabic form of ISIS. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.